Here is the first opportunity to engage during our development session. I've got some true or false statements for you and would love to get your thoughts. Put your thought in chat. Here's the first statement, and it is this: employees face unprecedented challenges today when it comes to bringing their best selves to work. What do you think? Let us know in chat, true or false. If you've got some additional thoughts around the statement, would love your perspective as well. So what do you think? Employees face unprecedented challenges today when it comes to bringing their best selves to work. All right, David Wright, what are you seeing?
I'm seeing a violent agreement that is true. And in a little bit of way, it's like after the year we've had, it probably feels pretty connected. But I think unprecedented, and this idea of bringing their best selves to work is sort of where we're headed with this question too, David, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reality is, and let us know if you're seeing some of this, that employees in many cases are bombarded with information, but they are starved for meaning. And when I talk about meaning, if we can go to the next slide, I'm thinking about meaning as taking information and making it relevant for me, as well as thinking about meaning that I, as an employee, want greater meaning in my life. What I've been through in the pandemic, I'm searching for meaning. I've had time to reflect. I've been through a lot. We continue to be through a lot. In many cases, the context of work has changed and our folks are looking for additional meaning. So are you, as a business owner, thinking about, as a leader, what's most important? Are you helping with that focus that's needed, as well as are you meeting the wants and needs of employees today? And that's really changed. And we'll talk about what those wants and needs are in just a moment. Here's our next true or false question. We'd love to know what you think. I don't have time to communicate. What's your thought on this one? I don't have time to communicate. True or false? And if you've got some thoughts as to what's behind your answer, would love to get your perspective on this idea and notion. What do you think?
Okay, Rico's out of the gate first, the second time. I've got three falses. False, feeling like people have time to communicate.
Yeah.
Anybody that feels opposite or doesn't feel like they have it? Great, Jonathan. Yeah. But not because it's easy, right? Like, I think both of what you're saying is like, because you make the effort, you do have time, but.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that's such an important mindset to have, of the need to figure out how do you make time. One of the top traps that we see with leaders is this idea of, I don't have time to communicate. And I realize sometimes even those of us that make time, it feels this way. I love to cook. I don't know about many of you. I am a clean as you go kind of cook. And I was cleaning with a friend recently. Let's just say she is not a clean as you go kind of cook. So I thought to myself, David, you work with leaders, you ask them to flex their style and approach. So flex your style and approach. And I have to say, I didn't care for it one bit. I had ingredients all over my kitchen. I had dirty dishes in the sink. We sat down to eat and the food just didn't taste as good as it normally did. That Pinot Noir was not as lovely as it usually is. And why is it that we always have time to clean up a mess, but we don't have time necessarily to be planful and purposeful? In that way, communications is a lot like cooking. So if you figure that out, bravo to you. If you do make time to communicate, that is hugely helpful, at least your most important communications. And we'll share with you in a few minutes a 5-step meaning-making framework to help you be even more effective and efficient as you plan that communication. And finally, if there's only one thing you take away from today, it's a reinforcement for many of you of the need to be planful and purposeful. It is the number one thing that you can do to provide the kind of focus to meet employees' needs, to activate them, and to feel good about how you're leading all at the same time.
So this is the next true false. As you think about your role, and I think some of this is in the prior question as well. Do you think of your role in communicating as you're someone that makes the weather? And I'll talk about what makes the weather looks like, but generally, do you find your role, true or false, in sort of establishing how people should view certain events, or creating context, or creating an environment around the way they hear things? Or are you reacting to some of the weather that you experience with them?
So what do you think? Let us know in chat. How do you answer and address that idea of I make the weather? What do you think?
You know what I'd love to do? I'm going to go. Oh, here we go. True and sometimes false. That that's a great point, and it's sort of a tricky question, right? Because it depends is the answer often. One time when we bring this idea of you make the weather, I will say that David and I and a few of our other colleagues at the Grossman Group used to work with someone, and we'd be told, this was a senior person, we'd be told before we got to their office what the weather was that day. Like, for instance, if you were coming with an idea, his admin, Helen, who I still keep in contact with, would say, hey, it's a little cloudy today, or hey, it's a little stormy now, or she'd say sunny, full speed ahead. Now, to be fair to that person, I don't think he really thought of it as something that we were testing, right? Like he was just being himself. But I think as a leader, what we have the opportunity to do, particularly in this difficult time, is to make the weather for other people. And I think one of the concepts that I see when we do training, particularly with executives and other communicators, and business leaders like yourself, is that, just having a mindset where you're accountable for making the weather, or your job is to try, can change your behavior in a positive way.
One other note before we just jump to the next question. The other thing that we find is that leaders, in many cases, underestimate the power or empowerment that they have when it comes to making the weather. And I think we've all been in situations where we get rained on and it just happens. It's a customer, it's someone on our board, it's a colleague. And then the question is, what do we do next? And do we rain on others, or do we wipe ourselves off and reflect and then step forward and communicate in a way that we're really going to feel good about, that feels empowering to others? So we often underestimate the power or empowerment that we have as leaders to really set the tone inside our organizations.
The last question, and there's a preview of the next, is I plan my most important communications. And I think some of you already sort of said, like, you make the time to communicate. Do you feel like you're always, true or false, do you tend to plan your most important communications, or is it sort of off the cuff? Rico does some planning, which is great. Thanks, Christopher. Yeah, the funny thing is, in a setting like this, we're all great, right? Like, we all do our stuff and plan. And I find sometimes that people don't always plan some of their communications. They plan the most important ones. And right, and actually, Alan, you're reading my mind. Like, it's most part, but important things pop up, right? Oh, that's interesting. And Jeremy, right, depends on what it is. And I think that's true, right? I think sometimes you have a plan. It's sort of, you think about, like, you got a go bag for a hurricane. You know what you're going to do when something big happens, but sometimes you have a little lead time so you can plan. And one of the ways we like to talk about planning and the importance of planning, and it's sort of connected to this weather idea, is I want everyone to take and this is an activity, just so you know, you can usually tell by the type of slide it is. I'd love for you in the text box, and when you can see all of the different numbers in sequence, these go all the way to 54, but when you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you can see them in sequence, not pick them out of sort of a hat, I'd love for you to say, like, just say got it, or say done in the text box. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to do this, but because usually people get on it right away, and so I don't want to belabor the point. But as soon as you see it, and you can confidently say where all of them are in order, let us know. I'll just be quiet for a second so that you can do that.
So I will have to say, most people find this exercise challenging and somewhat frustrating. Curious
Well,
how you're finding it.
Yeah, it's fun. We do this training a lot, and what's fun about it, what's also not fun is it does make you feel uncomfortable. Nobody says done or got it yet. So some of you, right, Jeremy, that's right. You see the numbers, but you don't see the sequence, and
Yeah.
that's most people's experience. Rico, head of the class, don't tell anybody the answer. So let me give you a little hint. If you know that there is a structure behind the numbers, and that's in the boxes that you see as they develop, you can see we go left to right, and then again in the middle, and then again at the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's pretty simple. What I'd love to do now, let me show you that series of numbers again and see what you think. And when you got it, let me know. That's right, Jeremy. Yeah, that's sort of the structure, but it wasn't a straight line purposefully, so that they, and it makes it more difficult. But as you see it now, I can't see everybody's faces, but shoot a done or a got it once you. So I see a couple of you, and I see a nodding head. Christopher, you just happen to be on the thing. Oh, thanks, Michael, Rico, super. Now, why do we do that? And the reason we do that is because as a leader, this can be a powerful way to think about the lives that you lead every day and yourself. Is that I think it's safe to say everybody has 54 competing things going on at any one given time, and probably more if you count like your personal life, and there are deadlines and there are things going on, and it's just super hard to see what's going on. So think about employees or your teams. One thing, if you can create a framework for people to understand, it's not like you can get rid of the 54 messages. The hope is you can narrow it down to 3 or 4, of course, but the truth is there's going to be competing ones no matter what. So if you can give them a way to adapt to that messaging, that's really, really the goal.
The other learning for me in this is this idea that while the numbers look random, as David said, there's actually a framework behind it. And once you know the framework, once you have a framework, it's a huge time saver, and notice how different it feels as well. So we brought for you today, as you think about how you elevate, how you lead and communicate, we brought 2 meaning-making frameworks that will help you, it'll save you time, it'll help you be even more effective as you think about how you lead and communicate. And the first one is about understanding your audience and your audience's needs.
And with that, one thing, and this seems very simple, but every time we do this with a group, we find it to be a rich area of discussion. We only have a little bit of time for this, but I would love for you to write in where communication happens, because we say communication happens in the mind of the blank. Where does it happen as a leader? Where do you think communication happens? It's deliberately vague, so there's really no wrong answers, but we have an idea of the right one.
So help us with what you think in chat. Fill in the blank. Communication happens in the mind of
Slack.
Okay.
That's great. Yes.
What else?
Slack is going to achieve intelligence and tell us where it happens. That's great. Anybody else? So think of it like in terms of the presenter, the person in our group I'm communicating with. Right, Rico. Yeah, I think that's sort of the idea. We would submit, and actually I can give you a real-time example, that communication happens in the mind of the recipient. And particularly in leadership, often what we do, and I am working with a company right now where they are stumbling around this idea in a very real way. Just to give you an example, they've been communicating and communicating and communicating in a variety of different ways. But the people that need to understand consistently say, I don't get it. I don't know. And as we've been talking to people, it makes sense. Like when they ask questions, it's very clear the reason they're not getting it is because they don't understand certain things about the message. And I know I'm being vague, but as I told the leadership there, if it doesn't happen in the mind of the people you're trying to get to, it really doesn't happen. And just because, and I think you've probably all heard this, right? Oh, I communicated, I sent the email, or I communicated, I put it in Slack, Chris. It's out there in the world, so therefore I communicated. And our submission, and we think this could be a bit of a game changer for people, is if you start thinking in terms of it's not what you do, but what people hear and understand, it can really change the way you approach things. And a way to sort of dig into that, and I'm the activity guy today, which is great. So we have another activity, which is I'm going to ask you to write in some things. And this is an order of hierarchy for what's important to employees. Now, what do we mean by that? And y'all probably seen things like the Gallup studies and the 12 statements. And so this is sort of boiled down over a lot of research over a lot of years for what are the 8 key questions all employees have. And there is an order. And what do we mean by an order? In that if I don't understand one of them, it's very hard for my mind to be open to another, right? So if I don't get X, I can't be open to new information. And what we want to do, I'm hoping everybody can see the screen, is we want you to take a look at these 8 questions. I want to be super clear. All of these questions are important. We know that for in general, employees will have at different times in their life will have these questions, and the questions will change over time depending on other answers. But there's an order to these. And if you look for it, what I'd love for you to look for is the one question that you think is most important, that if I don't answer this, I will not be able to ask any of the other questions. Like if I don't know this one. And what I'd love for you to do is to put the letter of the one you think, if I can't answer this, what's the next one? If you can put the letter in chat. I will tell you, for the sake of your comfort, people often give multiple letters. There is one answer, but people often see this from a different perspective. Chris is A. Does anyone care about me? That is so powerful right now. Any other thoughts on what it might be? C, which I have blocked, is how am I doing? Yeah, right? G, G is how can I help? People want to know how they can participate. It goes back to meaning, what David was saying a minute ago. F, what's going on? And I think, it's funny, as COVID was going down last year, that was the #1 question. What is happening right now? Another one for A, does it, Rico? Thank you. So I want to give you a little clue, and I think we're going down the right track here, is the way we think of this is in bunches. That there are me questions, which y'all hit on, does anyone care about me? How am I doing? What's my job? And there, are we questions. And so, as we look at the actual answers, which I've given us, good, I see a couple of A's, you'll see that the A, the C, the E are in the me category, which is likely sort of how you go in that. And then as we start thinking about the we and what we're doing and what's going on, you start seeing that in the we category. So we would submit that the right order of these is as follows. Well, just before we get there, the way people have needs generally builds out from a me to a we, right? Like you start with how I'm if I don't know how I'm doing, to the point that was made a minute ago, if I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, it's very hard for me to think outside myself. But once I do, I can start looking beyond. And so we start thinking about these things, and also as these needs, we need self-esteem, we need love and belonging, we need safety and security. We need our physiological needs, just our basic human needs, and to be self-actualized. We also need Wi-Fi, which we had added in recent years. Obviously, if we don't have Wi-Fi, we probably can't get anywhere. But the order, going back to the order, we submit that the order is here. We often assume what's my job is taken care of, right? That people have, and I've seen people struggle with this a little bit going, well, they know their job because they're in their job. And that might be true. If you think about it, like maybe that's something you've already accomplished. Often though, particularly in times of great change, people do question the very core of their job. What am I doing? Which goes to how am I doing? Which goes to, does anyone care about me? And David, I think you had a thought here as well as we were talking.
Yeah, you could argue, by the way, that there's a zero, which is, do I have a job? But we always like to think positively, that the model, much like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starts with this idea of what's my job. When it comes to this idea of does anyone care about me, and we'll show you the rest of the methodology in just a moment. As a number of you pointed out, there is a much greater spotlight and emphasis on this question than ever before, because does anyone care about me? It used to mean things like, does my boss know things that are important to me, but I care about outside of work? And today, does anyone care about me is about a flexibility with work and life events. It's about perks that are personal to me. It's about proactively managing work-related stress. It's about working on interesting projects. It's about remote work options. It's about financial wellness. There's this whole new list of expectations when it comes to employees that's incredibly important. And if we don't meet these me-focused needs, it's going to be very difficult for us to get up to the we-focused needs, which is all about sort of what's going on and then sort of what's happening in the organization. That's about strategy and how we're doing when it comes to strategy. So it's these me-focused needs that are so incredibly important. And the question for each of us today is, how are we doing for every individual employee that we have? Can they answer these questions? How can we help them answer these questions in ways that they're going to feel good about? Because that's what leads to engagement. And people asking the question, how can I help? How great would it be if 5, 10, 15% more people would ask the question, how can I help? I can do more. The reality is, with what we're seeing today, more people are in that me category. So let me pause there for a minute and would, happy to answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, we'll keep going here as we think about this idea of employee needs and how we as leaders can best meet them to get them engaged.
And I might add one comment there, David, as y'all think about this model, is that the transition is very much a pivot where a lot of leaders will start there, right? I want to tell you the news, or we see our communication as a news delivery service. And you may be able to say, I am 100% confident that I've answered the bottom three. One of the things we've uncovered in doing this is that sometimes that's something you shouldn't take for granted. And particularly with the changes in the workplace, just connecting with people, like, do you feel confident you know what you're supposed to do? Do you feel cared about? Do you know how you're doing? And if you can leave there, then you can have the email about here's how you connect the strategy, because it's so clear. Okay, well, obviously we'll take questions as we go, but hopefully that's helpful. This is all about a concept of, do I fit in? And what David's been talking about, what I feel pretty passionate about over the last 2 years, is this incredible mindset shift. By the way, do I fit in is something we've been talking about for years in employee communications. But with the changes in the environment, the changes in work style, the changes with COVID, people are starting to say, if I don't fit in, I'm going to find a place where I do. And so if you do take those 8 questions and you say, okay, do I really fit in? Is this a place where I can live out both my professional aspirations and my personal aspirations? And if I can't, do I move on? One of the concepts we talk about is, do you feel connected to the output of the organization? And you think about your business, and there's a classic story as you ask 2 people that are like, building, a wall in medieval Europe, and you say, when you ask a person what they're doing, and one says, I'm taking these bricks and I'm building a wall. And the second person says, actually, I'm building a castle. And it's really about perspective. Are you looking at near term or long term? And you'd love people to feel like they're connected and fit in and that they're building that castle together.
So as we think about this first meaning-making framework, we've talked about this idea about communication happens in the mind of the listener. This idea that we're very clear in our heads as to what we think, but to move people to action, it's about moving our audience, the listener, to action. We've talked about the 8 key questions that all employees have, that there's a hierarchy, that these are basic fundamental questions, simple in many cases, but very difficult to answer. And look at how personal those questions are. That in order to get folks engaged, we need every employee to be able to answer each of these questions, and that takes conversations. So the second meaning-making framework we wanted to share with you then is around this idea of planning. How do you plan each of your most important communications? And I see Jeremy has a question. Thinking about culture and environmental changes, do you think folks are asking, what are we doing to support the community or to support the environment? Yeah, absolutely. So the main question employees are asking is, how are we as an organization contributing? And how are we meeting what is important to me and my needs? That could be around sustainability or recycling or being a good community citizen. So this idea of employees' voice, what their wants and needs are, how are we doing at best meeting those needs or letting folks know we're needing to prioritize. So here's where we're focusing in our community as well.
And I think, Jeremy, that's a great question. I just build on that to say, it really depends on the person. Mm-hmm. It's not a broad, like necessarily everybody's focused on culture and environment, although many are, mm-hmm. are social issues. But they want to find where their meaning is connected. So for instance, one of my favorite things I saw a few years ago in the best places to work were the top 2 best places to work. One was Google and one was Boston Consulting Group. And there couldn't be two more different cultures, which says to me, regardless of those 2 companies, what matters to one person doesn't necessarily matter to another. So you find the home that you're looking for. And if it's culture and environment or social issues or just having a voice and doing good in the world, we do see that expanding, but it means very different things to different people. So you have to sort of connect in a way that's authentic to you and find the people that will authentically connect to that.
Yeah, you bet. And then one more thought before we jump into this planning model. Leadership has always been personal, but it is more personal than ever before today. Understanding individual employees' situations, what their home life is like, what their point of view is, what's important to them, what they're challenged with and struggling with, and helping them with how work can fit into their lives in a meaningful kind of way. And that is a big shift from where we've been in the past, and how are we as leaders thinking about how do we best meet those very different needs that employees have. All right, so here then is our second model for you, planning your most important communications. We call it Take 5. It's called Take 5 for 2 reasons. There are 5 steps here, and once you learn the model, the methodology, it literally can take you 5 minutes to plan any kind of communication. And I should let you know, we're happy to share this meaning-making framework with you after the webinar and all of our slides too, if that's useful. But let me run through the Take 5 model and approach. And notice where we start here. Notice where we don't start here. We start with this idea of outcome. What's the business outcome that we seek? Notice we don't start with what vehicle we're going to use, what message you want to get out. If communication at its finest is about moving people to action against our strategy, our goals, what we want to accomplish, as we're planning, we want to ground all of our thinking in the business outcomes that we seek. So that could be about employee retention. It could be about accelerating results. It could be about minimizing distraction or the downsides of change as things are evolving and as we're transforming in our organization. And one of the traps, by the way, here is that communication is not an outcome. Communication is an enabler to help us achieve what's important to us from a business perspective. So Take 5, our 5 steps to plan any communication, starts with this idea of what's the business outcome that you seek. Second, then, once we know what our business outcome is around the topic that we're needing to communicate, then it's about knowing and understanding your audience and their needs. And the idea here, much like we've talked about earlier, is the more you know about someone, the more you're able to move them to action, to empathize, to persuade. And the tool here is called audience mindset analysis, where we're asking some questions about our audience. First of all, who is our audience? Is it an individual? Is it a group? Where are they coming from on the topic that you want to communicate? What we're trying to do is get inside their heads. How are they thinking about this topic? What are their negative and positive perceptions? What are their concerns? How do they feel? So all of these questions can prompt us to not think about a topic from our perspective, but rather where's the audience coming from? So outcome is first. Then we use audience. Where are they coming from on the specific topic? And we use that audience mindset analysis, like getting inside our employees' heads then to think about how do we message. So outcome, audience, and then message. And as we think about messages, I'm thinking about just a couple of messages. There are a lot of ways we can tell a story. But once we know what our employees are thinking, how they're thinking about a specific topic, then we know how do we approach the topic, how do we talk about it with messages that are going to most address their concerns, where they're able to hear us, to listen to us, where we're addressing what their care abouts are. That's where the audience mindset analysis is really helpful as we get inside people's heads. And as we think about messages, we also think about this idea of 5 W's and an H. This is the tool that many journalists use to ensure that your message is complete. Because one of the big mistakes that we make when it comes to our messaging is that we sometimes forget to answer some basic questions. The most common thing we forget is the context. It's the why. Why is this the right decision? Why now? Why is this important? We often go right to what's happening. And as Simon Sinek said in his famous book, which is wonderful, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. You always start with the why. So I share this framework with you. It's a really helpful guide as you think about some of the questions that your employees are going to have, and some questions you're going to want to make sure you're answering in your most important communications to make sure that they're complete and they fall underneath the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So I'm hoping for you, this is a really helpful, useful tool as you're thinking about your messages and making them as complete as possible.
And David, just to build on that just a little bit and tie it back to the idea that communication happens in the mind of the listener and the recipient. I've recently been working with people. Now, this may feel obvious to everyone. Well, of course, I want to think about my audience. But more often than not, we think about messaging as being something devoid of audience, or it's something you're telling to people. And what we find is if you do audience first and then messaging, it tends to help people hear you and get across the things, and you start eliminating things that aren't important to them. Doesn't mean they're not important to someone, but if they're not important to them or important to their knowledge, it helps you clarify and get on the same page with them so they're open to other ideas.
You bet. And that's how we're creating meaning too, by ensuring a complete message that meets their needs. So the other thing to think about here is we think about message. So outcome, audience, message is this idea of hearts and minds. And of course, we're really good at sort of meeting folks' minds, the left side of the brain. We are less good in many cases at tapping their hearts, at providing the kind of inspiration that is also important. I was working with a leader recently, and he said, just, you give me the information and I'll help add the inspiration. And I thought that was hugely eloquent. So I wanted us to think for a minute about, and let us know inside chat, what are some ways as leaders that you tap people's hearts, that you create an emotional connection with them? What do you think? What are some strategies? What are some things you do to create that emotional connection? What do you think?
Data.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Stories, pictures. Stories, hugely, data is terrific. I think stories are an even more helpful tool. What's important about our stories, and as we think about stories in the workplace, what's different from stories that we tell at a barbecue, stories in the workplace, it's this idea that there's a moral. And the phrase for your toolkit after you tell a story is this: I share this with you because I've just told you the story because, and then fill in the blank. And that should lead you to a moral, a lesson, a learning, a behavior that you want to see. Honesty, stability, openness, willingness to support them. Absolutely. I think there are some others: listening, empathy, meeting their common needs. Here's where rewards and recognition fits, being flexible with work, personal perks, some of the other things that we talked about. So the lesson is sort of learning here as we're thinking about messages is how do we not just speak to the facts and data, but rather speak to the emotional, create that emotional connection, tap the other side of the brain that is so critical from an employee perspective. So outcome, audience, message, then it's method. So what's the vehicle that we use here? And how we think about this is the more complex the message, the richer the medium that you need. So by, we know what complexity means, but the idea of richness is that you get cues or clues as to how you're doing when it comes to how you're communicating. Of course, the richest method to communicate is face-to-face. And my bias, by the way, is our bias is face-to-face or face-to-face aided by technology. Because if you want to move someone to action, you need face-to-face or as close to face-to-face as you can get. If you need to persuade, you need consensus. It's a very difficult message. It needs to come in the form of conversation, not in the form of an email or a voicemail or in other ways. If it's important enough, it deserves your face-to-face or face-to-face, voice-to-voice kind of communication. So outcome, audience, message, method, and then last is measurement. And the question is sort of, how do you know how you're doing as you're communicating? And this really is, it's not about a survey. You could think about this idea of, are folks doing what you want them to do? But the true measure in many cases as you're communicating is to think about the questions that people ask. The questions that people ask tell us how we're doing. So as you're communicating, are these forward-looking questions that people are asking about implementation, about timeline, about how this is going to work? That it's clear to you that folks are with you, they're ahead of you in many cases, or are folks asking you about sort of the context and how do we get here and what's the rationale again for why we're doing this? Those questions tell you you aren't doing as good a job as you can when it comes to your overall communications. So those are the 5 steps of Take 5: outcome, audience, message, method, and measurement. And again, we'll share this tool with you as a follow-up. I know we've covered a lot quickly. We would love to take a minute to give you just some time to reflect. Based on what we've covered today, are there a couple of takeaways that are most meaningful for you as you think about your situation, what you want to consider doing differently coming out of today? And these could be ideas big, ideas small, whatever is most helpful for you. So let us give you just a couple minutes to reflect on what we covered today, what you hear that resonated, and then we'll ask you to share one thought, one takeaway in chat. So we'll give you a minute here just to think and reflect. When you've got something, we'd love, if you're open to it, to share it with us and your peers in chat. What do you take away from what we've covered today? What's been most helpful or useful? You really like the tool? Fantastic. By the way, if the tool resonates with you, the way to start using the tool is to think about it this way. So in the next week, can you use Take 5 for your most important opportunity? Just one in the next week. Then the following week, can you use it for 2 of your most important opportunities? So when you're trying to create a habit, like using a tool like Take 5, what's most helpful is to have a realistic kind of goal where you start to learn the methodology and approach and see some success with it. David, what else do you see in here from a headline and takeaway perspective?
Yeah, I mean, 2 thoughts that are great. I think this idea, which is, it's a big change for all of us, is this idea of these questions, the 8 questions that employees are asking, what they need to be powerful, and not just giving information and like giving like the thing they need and context. I think that can really change the way you approach it. And I'm glad that stood out. That communication is not an outcome. I will pound the desk on this, and because it's so funny, and you probably hear this at work and or like just in your life. It's like, I need to send an email, and people go to the method, right? They go to the thing, and not the outcome. And if you define your outcomes, what happens really all of us are looking for easier or better ways to communicate. If you focus on your outcome, as David pointed out, it narrows the field about what you need to do, right? So in terms of, if your outcome is something else, then all of a sudden you may not need to send an email. You may need to have a conversation and then an email. You may need to have a small group meeting. And so outcome driving your methodology, outcome audience, and so forth, can really change the way you approach things and actually make life a lot easier.
I realize we've got 2 minutes left. Would love any other takeaways that you have as you're doing that, and if you're open to sharing. If you're interested in a copy of my latest book, which is called Heart First, we are happy to share a copy with you today. There's a link on this slide. There's also a QR code if you want to use that as well. We'll paste it into chat. You get a book and you get a book. Hey, it's as close as I can get to in my Oprah-like kind of moment. And if you're interested in some books for your team as well, happy to share those with you. And by share, I mean we will send them to you free of charge. My wish today is to get this book and strategies and tools into the hands of leaders who can lead differently, who can lift others up, especially emerging leaders, and of course inside our community. How can we have the important kinds of conversations that we are a part of and want to be a part of as we think about a much more diverse and inclusive and respectful and healthy workplace. So if that's of interest to you, use one of the tools to get us your name and info, and we're happy to send a copy of the book to you. And with that, David and I just want to say thank you. Thanks for the time, energy. Please send us follow-up questions if you've got some thoughts or reflections. And again, if you're interested in the book, just send us your address and we'll get you a copy or 2. And with that, we say thank you. Have a great day. Thanks for including us in this really important day and session.
Thank you, everyone.